Whitney Houston was driving through the streets where she learned to sing, where gospel voices had first taught her that music could heal, where wooden pews and Sunday morning light had shaped the voice that now dominated pop radio worldwide. Her Mercedes turned onto Springfield Avenue, past the corner store where she used to buy penny candy, past the vacant lot where neighborhood kids played double dutch, past the church steps where she had sung her first solo at 11 years old. She was at the absolute peak of global superstardom. I Wanna Dance with Somebody had spent 3 weeks at #1. Her face was on every magazine cover. MTV played her videos in constant rotation. She had just signed a contract that made her the highest-paid female artist in music history. But today, driving through Newark on an unseasonably warm April afternoon, Whitney wasn't the untouchable pop icon the world saw on television. Today she was simply Nippy, Sissy Houston's daughter, coming home to visit her mother like she did every few weeks when touring schedules allowed. The traffic light at the intersection of Springfield and South Orange Avenue turned red. Whitney's car came to a stop, and that's when she saw him. An elderly man, maybe late 60s, moving between stopped cars with the careful shuffle of someone whose body had long ago given up on dignity. His clothes were layers of mismatched fabric, stained and worn thin by weather and time. His face was hidden beneath a salt and pepper beard that obscured most of his features. He carried a cardboard sign with words so faded they were barely legible. Whitney had seen hundreds of homeless people in her travels through major cities, and like most people, she had developed a kind of protective numbness to their presence. Her security team had strict protocols about interactions with strangers, but something about this particular man caught her attention in a way she couldn't immediately explain. Perhaps it was the way he moved, with a certain carefulness that suggested he had once moved very differently. Perhaps it was something in his posture that spoke of a fall from somewhere much higher than a street corner. As the man approached her car, Whitney's bodyguard, David Roberts, immediately tensed in the passenger seat and reached to lock the doors. But before he could, the man did something that changed everything. He began to hum, not loudly, not aggressively, just a soft, melodic humming that somehow carried through the sealed windows of Whitney's luxury vehicle. The melody was instantly, shockingly familiar. It was "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah," an old Welsh hymn that most gospel choirs knew, but this man was humming a very specific arrangement, a version with particular inflections and tempo changes that Whitney had only heard one place in her entire life. Her hands froze on the steering wheel. Her breath caught in her throat, because the arrangement this homeless man was humming was the exact version Professor James Wilson had taught her when she was 11 years old at New Hope Baptist Church. The version they had practiced together for 3 months before she performed it as her first solo. The version that nobody else in the world sang quite that way. The light was still red. The man had reached her window now, and as Whitney turned to look at him directly, he stopped humming and began to sing, his voice cracked and weathered but still carrying traces of the magnificent instrument it must have once been. "When I tread the verge of Jordan, bid my anxious fears subside." Those were the exact words where Whitney had always struggled with the high note, where Professor Wilson would stop the rehearsal and make her try again, encouraging her, believing in her when she didn't yet believe in herself. Whitney's hands were shaking now as she fumbled with the window control. David Roberts, her bodyguard, grabbed her wrist. "Whitney, you know the protocol. We don't engage with." But Whitney pulled her hand free and lowered the window anyway, her eyes fixed on the man's face, searching through the layers of dirt and beard and years for something she simultaneously hoped to find and dreaded to see. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me, sir. Where did you learn that song?" The man's singing stopped abruptly. He looked at Whitney with eyes that held a flicker of recognition, confusion, and something that might have been shame. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at the famous face framed in the window of the expensive car. Then, so quietly that Whitney had to lean closer to hear, he spoke. "I taught it to a little girl once, long time ago, beautiful voice, thought she might be something special someday." Whitney felt the world tilt sideways. Her vision blurred with sudden tears as 15 years of memory came flooding back all at once, as the impossible became undeniable, as she recognized in this broken man on the street corner the person who had quite literally created the foundation of everything she had become. "Professor Wilson," she whispered. "Oh my God, Professor Wilson, is that you?" The man's face crumpled. His cardboard sign fell from his hands and landed in the gutter. The cars behind Whitney's Mercedes began honking because the light had turned green. But she didn't move, couldn't move, could only stare at the man who had once stood tall in a pressed suit at the front of New Hope Baptist Church choir room, commanding respect and drawing miracles out of young voices, now standing in traffic, homeless and barely recognizable. 15 years earlier, 1974. 11-year-old Whitney Houston sat in the third row of wooden pews at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, watching Professor James Wilson conduct the adult choir with movements so precise and passionate they seemed to pull music from the air itself. The church was a modest building with high windows that let in streams of dusty sunlight, with creaking floorboards that had absorbed decades of prayers and songs, with an old upright piano that somehow produced sounds richer than instruments costing 10 times as much. Professor Wilson was a legend in Newark's gospel community, though his legend never extended beyond those who knew real music when they heard it. He had studied at Juilliard on a full scholarship in the 1940s, one of the first black students to do so, and he could have had a career in classical music, in opera houses and symphony halls. But he had chosen to come back to Newark, to the neighborhood where he grew up, to teach gospel music to kids who would never see the inside of a concert hall, to pour his considerable gifts into a community that needed beauty just as much as it needed food and shelter. Whitney had been attending New Hope since she was old enough to sit still through a service, brought by her mother Sissy Houston, who sang in the choir and occasionally served as a guest soloist. But Whitney had never been particularly interested in the music. She preferred playing outside after church to sitting through endless rehearsals. That changed the day Professor Wilson heard her humming along during choir practice. He had stopped the entire rehearsal, turned around from his position at the piano, and scanned the room until his eyes found 11-year-old Whitney in the back row. "You," he had said, pointing directly at her. "The young lady who was just humming. Stand up, please." Whitney had been terrified, certain she was in trouble for making noise during practice. But when she stood, Professor Wilson simply smiled and asked her to hum what she had been humming. Hesitantly, she did. The choir room went completely silent as her young voice, untrained but already showing signs of something extraordinary, filled the space with a purity of tone that made even the experienced adult singers catch their breath. Professor Wilson had walked slowly toward her, his face showing an expression Whitney would later recognize as the look of someone who had just discovered treasure buried in their own backyard. "Child," he had said softly, "has anyone ever told you that you have been given a gift?" Whitney shook her head. She knew her mother sang professionally, knew music was important in her family, but nobody had ever made her feel like her own voice was special. "Well, you have," Professor Wilson continued. "And it is my job, my calling, to help you unwrap that gift properly. Would you like to learn to sing? Really sing?" That question changed everything. For the next 4 years, from age 11 to 15, Whitney Houston studied under Professor James Wilson in a way that went far beyond typical vocal training. He taught her breath control by making her lie on the floor with books stacked on her diaphragm. He taught her emotional connection by having her read the lyrics of hymns as poetry before ever singing them. He taught her discipline by making her arrive 30 minutes early to every practice and stay 30 minutes late. He taught her humility by reminding her constantly that talent was God's gift to her, but what she did with that talent was her gift back to God. The first solo. After 3 months of intensive preparation, Professor Wilson announced that Whitney would perform "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah" as a solo during Sunday service. Whitney's mother, Sissy, was skeptical. Her daughter was only 11, untested in front of a real congregation, and this particular hymn was notoriously difficult with a vocal range that challenged even experienced singers. But Professor Wilson was insistent. "She's ready," he told Sissy. "And more importantly, she needs to learn that her voice isn't just for her. It's for everyone who needs to hear it." The Sunday of Whitney's first solo arrived with spring rain that drummed against the church's tin roof and made the old building feel even more intimate and sacred. The congregation was packed, nearly 200 people filling every pew, and as Whitney walked to the front of the church, her legs were shaking so badly she was certain everyone could see. Professor Wilson sat at the piano, his hands poised over the keys, and when he looked at Whitney, he gave her the same encouraging nod he had given her during hundreds of practice sessions. Then he began to play. The first notes of the introduction filled the church, and Whitney opened her mouth to sing. What came out was not the voice of an 11-year-old girl. What came out was something that seemed to channel generations of gospel tradition, something that made the congregation sit up straighter in their pews, something that caused Whitney Houston to grip the armrest of her seat and wonder if she was truly hearing what she thought she was hearing from her own daughter. Whitney sang all 4 verses without a single mistake, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each line. And when she reached the final chorus, something magical happened. The entire congregation rose to their feet, not in planned coordination, but in spontaneous response to the power they were witnessing. People who had attended New Hope for decades would later say it was the most moving solo they had ever heard in that sanctuary. When the last note faded, and the church erupted in applause and shouts of Amen and Praise God, Whitney looked at Professor Wilson, and he was crying. Not sobbing, but with tears streaming down his face as he stood from the piano bench and embraced his young student. "You just gave everyone in this room a glimpse of heaven," he whispered to her. "Never forget that this is why you were given this voice. Not for fame, not for money, but for moments exactly like this." For the next 4 years, Whitney continued to study with Professor Wilson, even as her mother's connections in the music industry began to create opportunities for professional work. Sissy was singing backup for artists like Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley, and sometimes Whitney would join her. But she always made time for Professor Wilson's lessons, always returned to New Hope Baptist Church, always remembered that the foundation of her gift had been built in that modest choir room with the patient guidance of a man who expected nothing from her except excellence and humility. Then, in 1978, when Whitney was 15, Professor Wilson's wife, Martha, died suddenly from a brain aneurysm. She was only 52 years old, and her death devastated Professor Wilson in ways that went beyond normal grief. Martha had been his partner for 30 years, his anchor, the person who had supported his decision to teach in Newark instead of pursuing a more prestigious career, the person who had made their small apartment feel like a palace. After Martha's funeral, Professor Wilson stopped showing up to choir practice. Weeks turned into months, and the congregation tried to reach out, tried to support him, but he had retreated into a solitude so complete that even his closest friends couldn't penetrate it. Whitney, caught up in her own rapidly accelerating music career, lost touch with her beloved teacher. She was being groomed for stardom now, recording demos, performing in clubs, and the world of gospel choir practice seemed increasingly distant from where her life was heading. Back to 1989. Whitney Houston sat in her Mercedes at the intersection of Springfield and South Orange Avenue, staring at the homeless man who had once been Professor James Wilson, trying to reconcile the dignified, commanding figure from her memory with the broken person standing before her now. The cars behind her were still honking, angry at the holdup, but Whitney didn't care. She put her car in park right there in the middle of the intersection, opened her door, and stepped out onto the street. David Roberts, her bodyguard, immediately protested. "Whitney, you cannot get out of the car in the middle of traffic. This is a security nightmare." But Whitney was already moving toward Professor Wilson, her arms opening, her face wet with tears, and when she reached him, she wrapped him in an embrace that made him stiffen with surprise and shame. "Professor Wilson," she said, loud enough for the gathering crowd of onlookers to hear. "I've been looking for you. I've been trying to find you for years." This wasn't entirely true. Whitney had thought about Professor Wilson occasionally over the past decade, had meant to track him down and thank him properly. But her life had become a whirlwind of recording sessions and concerts and media obligations, and those good intentions had never translated into action. But in this moment, holding this man who smelled of street life and desperation, feeling his body shake with sobs against her shoulder, the lie became a kind of truth because she suddenly realized that, yes, she had been looking for him. She had needed to find him. She just hadn't known it until this very second. The traffic situation was becoming chaotic. Other drivers were getting out of their cars to see what was happening, some recognizing Whitney and pulling out cameras. David was on his radio calling for backup security. A police car was approaching with lights flashing. But Whitney was focused entirely on Professor Wilson, who had collapsed in her arms and was crying with the kind of despair that comes from years of accumulated loss. "What happened to you?" Whitney asked, though she already knew that the question was almost cruel in its impossibility to answer adequately. How do you explain the gradual dissolution of a life? How do you trace the path from respected music teacher to homeless street corner? Professor Wilson tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, with Whitney still holding him, he managed to whisper, "I lost her, I lost Martha, and then I lost the music, and then I lost myself. I'm sorry, Whitney, I'm so sorry you have to see me like this." Whitney tightened her embrace. "There's nothing to be sorry for. You saved me once, now it's my turn to save you." What happened next created a media frenzy that followed Whitney for weeks, with police officers directing traffic around them, with photographers capturing every moment, with David Roberts desperately trying to manage an impossible situation. Whitney Houston guided Professor James Wilson into the back seat of her Mercedes, got in beside him, and instructed her driver to take them to the nearest hotel that could provide a suite on short notice, the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Newark. Within an hour, Professor Wilson was sitting in a luxurious suite that probably cost more per night than he used to make in a month teaching music. Whitney had ordered room service, called her personal assistant to bring clothes from a nearby store, and arranged for a doctor to come do a wellness check. But most importantly, she just sat with him, holding his hand, letting him tell the story of the past 11 years in fragmented pieces that painted a picture of devastating decline. After Martha died, Professor Wilson explained, he had tried to continue teaching, but grief made it impossible to hear music the same way. Every song reminded him of his wife. Every choir practice felt like a betrayal of her memory. He started drinking to numb the pain, first just in the evenings, then throughout the day. He lost his position at New Hope Baptist Church not because anyone was cruel, but because he simply stopped showing up. His apartment, the one he had shared with Martha, became unbearable. He couldn't look at her clothes still hanging in the closet, couldn't sit in the chair where she used to read, couldn't sleep in the bed where she had died. He stopped paying rent, got evicted, moved to a smaller place, lost that too. Drifted from temporary housing to shelters to eventually just sleeping wherever he could find a dry spot. "I became invisible," Professor Wilson said, his voice hoarse from crying and from years of not using it properly. "The man I used to be just faded away until all that was left was this." He gestured at his tattered clothes, his unwashed state. "I watched you on television sometimes, in store windows when I was passing by. I saw you become everything I always knew you could be. And I was proud, but I was also ashamed that I had fallen so far while you had risen so high." Whitney felt anger rising in her throat, not at Professor Wilson, but at herself, at a world where someone who had given so much could be discarded so completely, at the injustice of talent and dedication being no protection against the random cruelties of life. "You didn't fall," she said firmly. "You were pushed by grief that would have destroyed anyone, but you're not destroyed. You're still here. And I'm going to make sure you get back to where you belong." Over the next 2 days, Whitney postponed recording sessions, canceled meetings, and dedicated herself entirely to beginning the process of restoring Professor Wilson's life. She arranged for him to enter a rehabilitation program that specialized in grief counseling and addiction treatment. She paid for 6 months in advance. She hired a caseworker to handle the bureaucratic nightmare of getting him proper identification, medical care, and eventually housing. But the most important thing Whitney did was much simpler. On the second evening, she asked Professor Wilson if he would be willing to play piano for her, just for a few minutes, just to see if the music was still there. The hotel suite had a beautiful baby grand piano in the corner, and Professor Wilson approached it the way someone might approach a lover they had abandoned, with longing and fear mixed together. His hands, weathered and scarred from years on the street, trembled as he touched the keys. "I don't know if I remember how," he said. Whitney sat beside him on the piano bench the same way she used to sit during lessons 15 years ago. "Play Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah. The way you taught me, please." Professor Wilson's fingers found the opening chords hesitantly, making several mistakes in the first few bars. But then something miraculous happened. Muscle memory kicked in. The years fell away. And suddenly he was playing with the same confidence and beauty that Whitney remembered from childhood. As he played, she began to sing, her voice now mature and powerful in ways it hadn't been at 11, but still carrying the purity and emotional honesty that he had first heard all those years ago in the New Hope Baptist Church choir room. They performed the entire hymn together, student and teacher, reconnected across a chasm of time and trauma. And when the last note faded, both were crying again, but this time with something that felt like hope. 6 months later, Professor James Wilson completed his treatment program and emerged physically healthier and emotionally stabilized. Though the scars of his years on the street would never fully disappear, Whitney had kept her promise and more. She had purchased a small house for him in a quiet neighborhood near where New Hope Baptist Church still stood. She had set up a trust fund that would provide for his basic needs for the rest of his life. But she had also done something that Professor Wilson initially resisted but ultimately accepted as the truest form of healing she could offer him. She convinced him to return to teaching. New Hope Baptist Church's music program had suffered in the years since Professor Wilson's departure. The choir still sang, but without the excellence and discipline he had instilled. When word spread that Professor Wilson might be willing to return, the current pastor reached out immediately with an offer not just to restore his old position, but to expand the program in ways that honored his contributions. On a Sunday morning in October 1989, Professor James Wilson walked to the front of New Hope Baptist Church for the first time in 11 years. The sanctuary was packed not just with regular congregants, but with former students who had heard about his return, with members of Newark's gospel community who remembered his legacy, and with media representatives curious about the teacher who had shaped Whitney Houston's voice. Whitney herself was there, sitting in the same third-row pew where she used to sit as a child. When Professor Wilson sat at the piano and began to lead the choir through their first song, the sound that emerged was rusty at first, uncertain, like an engine that needed time to warm up. But by the second verse, the old magic was returning. The precision, the passion, the ability to draw something transcendent from voices that individually might be ordinary but collectively became extraordinary. After the service, Whitney approached her old teacher and asked him a question she had been thinking about for weeks. "Professor Wilson, I want to record a gospel album. A real one, not pop songs with gospel influences, but actual hymns and spirituals. Would you consider helping me arrange it? Would you conduct the choir?" Professor Wilson looked at this young woman who had achieved fame beyond anything he had ever imagined, who could work with the most celebrated producers in the world, who was asking him, a man who had been homeless 6 months ago, to guide her back to the music that had started everything. "Only if you promise me something," he said. "What's that?" "Promise me you'll never forget where you came from. Not this church, not even Newark, but the reason why you were given that voice. It wasn't for magazine covers or gold records. It was for moments like the one we had when you sang your first solo, for giving people a glimpse of something greater than themselves." Whitney smiled and took his hand. "I promise, but you have to promise me something too." "What?" "Promise you'll never forget that you matter, that what you give to people through music is just as important as anything I could ever do on a stage. That teacher and student are really just two parts of the same song." Professor Wilson nodded, unable to speak through the emotion closing his throat. The gospel album that resulted from this collaboration was released in 1991. It wasn't Whitney's most commercially successful project, but it was the one she was most proud of, the one that reminded the world and herself that beneath the pop superstar was a girl from Newark who had learned to sing in a church choir under the guidance of a patient teacher who believed in her before anyone else did. Professor Wilson conducted the New Hope Baptist Church choir on every track. The arrangements were his, honoring traditional gospel while showcasing Whitney's voice in ways that felt both contemporary and timeless. Critics called it a masterpiece of the genre. Gospel purists appreciated its authenticity. But for Whitney and Professor Wilson, the album's true value had nothing to do with sales or reviews. It was the physical manifestation of a promise kept, a life saved, and a circle completed. Professor Wilson continued teaching at New Hope Baptist Church until his death in 1996 at the age of 73. His funeral was attended by hundreds of former students, gospel legends from across the country, and of course, Whitney Houston, who sang "Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah" one final time for the man who had taught her not just how to sing it, but why it mattered. In her eulogy, Whitney told the story of their reconnection on that street corner in 1989, and she revealed something she had never publicly shared before. "I was lost that day I drove through Newark," she said. "I was at the top of the charts, but I was spiritually empty. I had forgotten why I sang. I had forgotten that music is supposed to be service, not just entertainment. Finding Professor Wilson on that corner wasn't me saving him. It was him saving me one more time. He reminded me where I came from and why that matters." When Whitney Houston herself died in 2012, it was the New Hope Baptist Church choir, still using Professor Wilson's arrangements and methods, that sang at her funeral. The current choir director, one of Professor Wilson's former students, led them through Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah, with the same passion and precision that had defined the program for decades. In the years since, the story of Whitney Houston and Professor James Wilson has become more than just a celebrity good deeds story. It has become a reminder about the invisible threads that connect teachers and students, about the responsibility that comes with gifts recognized and developed, about the way a single moment of compassion can ripple outward in ways we never anticipate. There is now a scholarship fund at New Hope Baptist Church called the Professor James Wilson Music Education Award, funded by Whitney's estate and given annually to young singers from Newark who show not just talent, but the kind of humility and dedication that Professor Wilson valued above all else. Recipients of the scholarship receive not just financial support, but a leather-bound book containing Professor Wilson's teaching philosophy, lesson plans, and personal notes on the spiritual foundation of gospel music. On the first page of each book, in Whitney Houston's handwriting, are the words Professor Wilson spoke to her at her first solo, words that became the guiding principle of both their lives. Talent is God's gift to you, but what you do with that talent is your gift back to God. And on street corners throughout Newark, on the same blocks where Professor Wilson once stood homeless and broken, young people still sing gospel music, their voices rising toward heaven, carrying forward a tradition that one teacher refused to let die, and that one student refused to let the world forget.